Ukraine, Russia, Israel, NATO, Poland, inflation, food shortages, energy crisis, Canadian crackdowns, authoritarian rule, education and ticked-off moms, medical restrictions, Iranian missiles, Hillary, censorship, Gog of Magog, and Babylon. Yes, I did say Babylon. The second most mentioned city in the Bible is in the news again. And these are just some of the opening accounts from what is happening in the nations now. Please join us as we unravel today's top stories from around the world in Modern Headlines Meets Bible Prophecy, March 2022. I am Mark Russak, and you are listening to The Russak Outlook. As always, just my opinion. Hello, everybody. My name is Mark Russak. You're watching and listening to The Russak Outlook. Thank you so much for joining. Delighted that you're here. Today's topic is part of a monthly series that we're doing titled Modern Headlines Meets Bible Prophecy. And what we do is try to look at the events that's happening around the world as it pertains to nations, cultures, technology, things like that, and how it may or may not line up with what we see in the Bible concerning what will ultimately lead up to the return of Jesus. Bible prophecy is a little over a quarter of the Bible. 2/3 of that has already been fulfilled, so there's a large portion of the Bible that still is yet to come. But as we sit here, we look into the lens of Bible prophecy, and so much of what is unfulfilled leads up to the second coming of Jesus. And, you know, I think if you have a half a pulse, you can see that there are things that are a little squirrely in the world today, whether you believe in Jesus and the Bible and the return of the Lord or not. And it's interestingly, I find things are lining up so much with how the Bible laid out thousands of years ago. So that's the abridged version of what we try to do here and look at. So if you wouldn't mind, if you do appreciate topics like this, please hit the like and the subscribe button. It really helps us get the information out. And also, if you could share it. We're on a lot of the social media platforms. We're moving into some other platforms. We'll soon be on Rumble. We're all on the podcast platforms and YouTube. So please hit that like and subscribe button if you do like information like this, because again, my heart is always to get at the truth no matter where it leads. And that's ultimately what we're talking about. Last, I'll just ask if you wouldn't mind going to the Russak Outlook, join our email list so that we can notify you of new events, new topics that are coming out. We are engaged in some live presentations, Zoom presentations twice a month. So you can get the password and the link for that if you're interested, covering a variety of topics, but engaging you, having you come in, ask comments, questions, insight, things the Lord may have put on your heart. And the foundational passage for that is really iron sharpens iron, how we all need one another and we need the church. So much to get into because we're at the end of February going into March. And obviously, with what's happening in the Ukraine-Russia war, that's going to be a lot of what we talk about at the top of this. But there's so much other information to cover. So let me actually show you what I'm talking about here. So if you're following me on video, some of the topics and things that we're going to hit on: Russia, Ukraine, Israel, how this may or may not line up or impact Israel. And that's ultimately, if you are looking at prophecy, what is the relationship, what are the nations' relationship to Israel is going to be the number one factor. The United States, NATO, Syria, Nord Stream 2, Germany, President Macron, gas and energy prices obviously skyrocketing even more. They were before this, and we'll talk about some of the strategies or lack of strategy. Inflation, Joe Rogan, censorship is really what that's about. Hillary, Beijing Olympics, Canadian truckers and Trudeau, many people, I'm sure the world knows about that. The food shortages here in America, education and ticked off moms. Babylon, I know. What do you mean Babylon? Well, there's some interesting developments there. Bahrain, UAE, the Houthis, and Israel again, the Russia-China relationships, medical restrictions. So much has happened in this month, so much to cover. So you can understand, why I say we're going to start with Russia and Ukraine, but there's a lot to cover. So buckle up and hold on. Let me jump to the next slide. Let me show you some maps here. pretty much, if like where I sit is just about approaching day 6 of the war. So most people would understand the significance of the gas and the energy cards that Putin holds. How he is the #1 driver or deliverer of energy into Eastern and Western Europe, and a lot of that goes through Belarus and Ukraine. You see some of the gas lines that are happening there. And his additional concern, or so he's voiced it, is, Ukraine moving more and more towards the West. They've wanted to join NATO since the fall of Russia in the early 90s. And I believe that it's really a fear that the NATO countries were concerned that this would kind of push Putin too far in terms of being an aggressive move. But nonetheless, at least in America, they said that they would serve and help the Ukrainian people, and that eventually they would get in. So I don't, when you say eventually, that's really an unfulfilled promise. That goes back to President Clinton in the early 90s. But they've wanted to come into NATO for a long, long time. It looks, for the most part, they're looking to move towards freedom, because I would say so much of the topics that I just mentioned for February, so much of that is centered on the desire for freedom. And that's so important. So, just keep that in mind. So let me get back to the maps. I do want to show you the top right, where it's the Black Sea. Russia controls Crimea, but now if they can get Ukraine or all of Ukraine, they control that Black Sea. If you're looking towards Ezekiel 38, that is a strategic initiative that would be significant to whoever Gog is, whether it's Putin or not, and we'll cover a little bit of that, because that passageway, if you look south of that, as it has to go through the Bosphorus River to the Aegean Sea and leading into the Mediterranean Sea. So that whole point on the bottom of the Black Sea, that landmass there is Turkey. So interestingly, Ezekiel 38 says Turkey will be one of the nations that invades Israel with Russia and a host of other nations. So there could be cooperation there. But I'm going to cover some interesting developments with Turkey. And I'll get to that in a number of slides down the road here. The last on the right, you see the military buildup in and around the borders of Ukraine. And as I said, Belarus is really kind of in the pocket of Russia. They are working very hand in hand, and he's been opening up the doors to allow the Russian military to build up there. So let me go to the next slide. And I'm showing you NATO here on the right, where all of the blue nations in Europe, they're already in NATO. And then you can see Belarus and Ukraine is not. Sweden and Finland at the top. Well, there was, let me just say that, he made some he being Putin, he made some threats to Finland and Sweden. I don't know if that's saber rattling or not, but that just came out within the last day or two. But let me get back to this map. So Ukraine and Belarus, as I said, is pretty much in the pocket of Russia. So Ukraine has been wanting for a long, long time, 25 years or so, if not more, to get in with NATO. And they're still trying to, even today, I think Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, asked for a temporary admittance into NATO to at least get them over the hurdle of this war, if that is possible. The squiggly lines in the map is my poor art. I wanted to show you, just to kind of give you an idea. Ezekiel 38 talks about Russia leading a host of nations, and the significance of the Black Sea. If you look at the red squiggly line above Turkey, and how that would ultimately lead into the Mediterranean, into the ports of Israel, into the shore fronts of Israel along the coast, and then also North Africa. It would potentially open up sea lanes. Well, if they're engaged with Russia, and they eventually will be, they have sea lanes to possibly go through there. And then last is those purple squiggly lines would be the landmass passageways that they would be able to get in. So you can see that Israel would be pretty overwhelmed. And then top left, I show you that Turkey is the bridge. Turkey is the bridge to get from Europe into what eventually will be Israel, but you can see that they're in Syria today. We know that. We know Iran is in Syria on the border of Israel where we sit. So that's kind of setting up a lot of what I want to talk about, because so many people are asking, how does this impact Ezekiel 38 and 39, if in fact it does? And the short answer is, it doesn't in the immediate, but it could be a precursor. It could be leading up to what we may see down the road. I think it's too premature to tell, but it looks like some of the pieces are starting to fall in place. So because of that, I wanted to go into or examine, so many people are asking, is Putin Gog? So if you're not familiar with the War of Gog of Magog, you can find that out. I've covered that. I think I called it the next great war in one of my earlier videos. But plenty of information out there. And it talks about an end-time invasion of countries that will come and attack Israel, and it will be led by Russia, Turkey, Iran, some of the North African countries, some of the stand countries in southern Russia. And eventually they will come into the mountains of Israel, but the Lord will overcome and defeat them. And no army will, including Israel. It will be the Lord's hand. The Lord will be glorified in it. And I believe it will be a great call of people who will know that Jesus is the Christ. And he is the one who takes care of this situation. But it will happen. This is a 2,500-year-old prophecy, and interestingly, the nations are lining up just as the prophet Ezekiel said. So let me cover the opening of it. Ezekiel 38, 1 through 6. Now the word of the Lord came to me, saying, Son of man, set your face against Gog of the land of Magog, the prince of Rosh, Meshach, and Tubal. Prophesy against him, say, Thus says the Lord, Behold, I am against you, O Gog, prince of Rosh, Meshach, and Tubal. I will turn you around, put hooks into your jaws, and lead you out with all your army horses, horsemen, all splendidly clothed, a great company with bucklers and shields, all of them handling swords. Persia, Ethiopia, Libya are with them, all of them with shield and helmet. Gomer and all of its troops, the house of Togarmah from the far north and all of its troops, many people with you. So a lot of those nations that I mentioned are, that's been researched by scholars, and it points to all of the countries that I show you here on the map. And it's predominantly led by Russia. So let me cover some of the things. If you're following me, the yellow highlight. The modern counterparts to these areas are Russia, Turkey, Iran, Libya, Sudan. More nations will probably participate, as the catch-all phrase, many people are with you. Going down to the green highlights. The name Gog, which occurs 11 times in Ezekiel 38 and 39, is the name or title of the leader of the invasion. We know this because he is directly addressed several times by God, called a prince, and repeatedly referred to by personal pronouns. He is of the land of Magog, indicating he is an individual. Gog is not the leader's name, but serves as a title like Pharaoh, President, Czar. Gog may mean high, supreme, or height, or elevated somehow. But interestingly, there is a Sumerian word, Gug, which means darkness. That could potentially line up with him, because remember, Ezekiel was living in the land of Babylon, which is modern-day Iraq, and that is where the Sumerians would have been. So that gives you, the quick version. So, is Putin Gog, and are we looking at it, is really what a lot of people have been asking. So let me do this. Let me just say what I believe is it's a potential foreshadowing, but not the fulfillment. And it doesn't tie directly to Israel, but it does touch on them, and I'll cover that. The other interesting thing I find is President Zelensky. Again, I'm at day 6, so many people can see the bravery, the courage that he's showing and leading his people. The 46th administration offered to get him out of there. He said, I don't want to leave. I'm staying with my people. What I need is arms. So a lot of people are admiring his courage, and I believe the nation and the people there are following suit. He is the grandson of a Holocaust survivor. He is Jewish, and he's worked very closely with the people of Israel. He has a good relationship with them, and I would not be surprised if the hand of the Lord is on him. So, the odds are overwhelmingly against the Ukrainians, but we don't know what the Lord has in mind and how the Lord is going to use this. This will be utilized by the Lord no matter what, and it's all in His timing. And I don't understand it all, and I won't pretend to, but I am following along and watching interestingly how these nations are lining up according to the prophet Ezekiel. So let me just touch on, I show you here the leaders of Erdogan and Putin here with the former Iranian Ayatollah. He is no longer in office. You have Ayatollah Rouhani. So you have these nations that are coming together. They are working. Is this tied into Ukraine? I don't know. The other thing I would say is where I sit today, the world is coming against Putin, which I am thrilled at. The unification in Europe has been, over the last couple of days, I would say outstanding. Germany is stepping up, which is so important for the Germans to help the Ukrainians, and they're bringing military equipment in. The U.S. has finally acquiesced, and they're sending some things over. I guess the bottom line I would say to you is, or remind you and encourage you to please pray for the people of Ukraine. They are wonderful, delightful people. I am a little bit biased. My grandfather was from Ukraine. He got out of there when he was 17 years old, lived in Kiev, because he saw what was happening with the Russian czars. He wandered out, left his family, came to New York City, like so many great American stories through Ellis Island in the early 20th century. He taught himself how to be a tailor. He taught himself the language by reading the comic books, and met this wonderful woman who was another immigrant from Hungary, my grandma Margaret, and his name was Sigor in Russian or Ukrainian, and he became Sydney. They gave him the name Sydney. But I guess the other interesting thing that I find is, and I'm proud of this, that, my father was an only child, so they raised my father in Alphabet City in Manhattan, and he went on to serve in World War II, where I got to meet so many of his friends they would get together after the war on a monthly basis. They were called my uncles. Their wives were my aunts. We went on vacations together. This was a great generation, but what I find interesting is my grandparents left Europe because of communism, because of what was happening over there, and they raised a son who wound up going over and fighting against that, 20, 30 years later. But it's a great story, and so pray for these people. Many, many churches are supporting missionaries over there. The hand of God is on these people. So, just continue to stand and pray and believe for the impossible. I know the odds don't look good, and no matter what, it's in the Lord's hand, but our prayers count. So I encourage you to please continue to pray for these people in Ukraine, in and around there. So let me jump to what else is happening. Let me show you what's going on, kind of the quick headlines of the other areas in the Israel and Middle East. AI is becoming a big factor in the arsenal or the weaponry of Israel. Here, the Brigadier General Aviad Dagan, he is saying artificial intelligence, the war data factory. So they are taking this data, utilizing it with artificial intelligence. Is becoming a big weapon in their tool belt. He claims that this can actually win wars. So you know about the technological advances, you know about the significance of Israel and their military. I would say if you look at Israel today, you're probably looking at the top
I believe the top 5 military, which again is another sign that the hand of the Lord is on them. Here's this tiny country the size of Lake Michigan. And, some people may say it's not quite that strong. Even if you put them in the top 10, it's a modern day miracle. And what their advances and their knowledge and their technology has just been outstanding. So just look for more and more weaponry to be used in AI. I show you on the top IDF drills for winter war. I just wanted to point that out because a lot of times people, you don't realize that you think of Israel, you think of the desert and oppressive heat. Well, you go north of Israel and you can go skiing in some parts of Israel. So they have to build vehicles and prepare for, some of the rough terrain there. The other not interesting for them, it's a common development. I showed you the missile attacks that are coming from northern Israel, from Syria. And the reason I do that is, as horrendous as the footage we're watching in Ukraine and the sirens going off and encouraging to get underground in the subways, and I don't think they have necessarily bomb shelters. This is it's a very often occurrence, not a daily occurrence, that the Israelis have to live with. So as horrible as this is, I just wanted to point out, Israel deals with this it's almost become part of their livelihood. So, keep that in mind with what's happening around the world. Because they're surrounded by enemies. They're surrounded by people that want to destroy them. Laser defense systems are being unveiled in the Israeli army. According to Israeli intelligence, Iran has enriched enough uranium for 1 nuclear bomb. It's not been public knowledge. This is what their intelligence reveals. I will say I don't believe Israel will allow the development of Iran to get those nuclear weapons, and that in and of itself could easily spark the Ezekiel 38-39 war. Iran, I show you, unveiled a new missile it's a ballistic missile that can reach U.S. air bases as well as Israel. And, the show goes to show how sick this is. On state television, they showed this missile, and it's called the Khaybar Buster. The name is about the Jewish oasis called Khaybar. It is now present-day Saudi Arabia. It was overrun by Muslim warriors in the 7th century. So they tell you, hey, we've made this bomb, and it's specifically addressed to destroy Israelis, to destroy the Jewish people. Next, 46th administration no longer supporting the Middle East pipeline coming out of Israel. So again, I'm going to talk about gas and energy. Russia has the upper hand there. Israel has discovered vast amount of gas resources and energy resources. They've built the pipeline going in the Mediterranean towards Crete, towards Greece, into Italy. They have agreements there. They want to continue funneling that into Western Europe. And the 46th administration now, within this month in February, came against and said we no longer support it. So you wonder what's going on there. And the 45th administration was a big supporter because he cited the fact that you're going to need to combat what Putin is coming down with, which is why America was so strong with energy independence. Let me pause here for a second, switch to American energy for a second. America, before the 46th administration, was completely self-reliant, and we had enough energy resources. The day that 46 came in, he shut down the Keystone Pipeline and put in all different types of legal limitations and red tape that would basically shut down American energy production. It was intentional. It was by design, and feeding into part of the whole climate propaganda. I'll say it. So we're in a situation now where we have this war, and if America releases its energy production, it will cripple Putin and what's happening there. Even if you temporarily released it, it would have such a significant impact. But that goes to show some of the insanity of what the world is right now. It's something simple that can be done with the flick of a switch, but the politics and the people in power and their agenda, and it's a globalist agenda that's holding it. So let me go back to the slide here. I wanted to show you how wonderful Israel is. They're rescuing Ukrainian Jews. It's part of their program. They're on the border right now in Poland and I believe in Hungary, but I know in Poland. So as soon as Jews come across, if you are Jewish, you show them that information, they will take you and they will bring you into Israel and they will open up the doors. It's part of their policy, but it's part of what they do around the world. But in particular, I would just say they're stepping up and helping their Jewish citizens. And it's an awesome, it's a wonderful gesture by them and their government. Going back to the Middle East. What's happening with the UAE and the cooperation? This is part of the Abraham Accords. So interestingly, now you have airspace where you have the Israeli president traveling over to the UAE. Saudi Arabia has opened up airspace for Israelis to travel now. The trade and the cooperation that's going on there. That's a huge statement. That cannot be underestimated, the fact that you have cooperation now with many a fair amount of Muslim nations. You had 4 peace accords with Muslims that were orchestrated by the 45th administration, and you wouldn't hear a blip about that. Imagine 4 Arab countries signing peace treaties with Israel, and America has a role in it. But you wouldn't want anybody to mention that. This is how bizarre our media and our reporting is. It's incredible. Israel will be directly affected if Russia escalates because of the large production of Ukraine. Many people will know corn, grain, wheat coming out of Ukraine. It's going to have a tremendous impact on the food shortages around the world, food production. So it'll be interesting to watch. U.S. Israeli militaries did conduct exercises where the United States were observers, where it was kind of a simulation if Iran used a nuclear bomb or if the Americans got engaged with the Israelis. So there was some joint sharing of information, how they would proceed with that. Social discontent in Iran is being reported, and that the people are stepping up, the people are recognizing what's happening around, and they don't want any part of it. So clearly, whatever the Americans can do to help drive that message, it kind of goes back to the whole green flag thing back in the 2012, 2013, 2014 area. You want to help the Iranian people. What a rich culture. I would love to go to Iran one day. I really would. But I probably never will because of what's happening there. I'm sure I never will. I guess never say never, but it's just such a rich culture, such beautiful people, and then to see what's happening over there is just it's heartbreaking. And I talked about this next slide showed about the Americans coming against the gas shortage or the gas delivery over from Israel on over into the Mediterranean to parts of Europe, which again it doesn't make sense on paper, why they would do that. But I do know that if you look at 44 and 46, there's a real bias there against Israel. So that's interesting. Let me point this out. This has nothing to do with the Bible in this sense, but I found this interesting. The finance minister of Israel, Avigdor Lieberman, had 4 catalysts that he sees. Unless something is going to be done and that the world superpowers come together, meaning China, Russia, and the United States, the world is going to come to an end. And he cites 4 particular reasons. The emergence of technology driven by artificial intelligence. There are young hackers who are capable of doing things with their computers and cell phones that were unimaginable a few years ago. There is no form of regulation. This takes us to a place that is potentially frightening. And I would agree. And even with the war today, with what's happening, I digress for a second, because of the mention of hackers. There are groups of hackers around the world that are now trying to infiltrate Russia and Moscow to offset what they're doing. So here you have, I would call them technology mercenaries that are not affiliated and not coordinated, that best that I know of. I'm sure there are hackers with governments, I know there are, but you have this rogue element that's a new weapon, or it's a new development in potentially 21st century technology wars. Let me go back to this. The rise of cryptocurrencies across the globe. There are 15,000 different types of cryptocurrencies today. And he talks about how all the nations are kind of driving towards digital currency. When you have economic sanctions like what we're seeing in Iran and Russia and China, they can get around it. They can work with one another. They do. They prepare for this. None of this is taken them by surprise. So they get around it, and they're moving more towards their own digital currency. So you see financial relationships developing. The relationship with Russia and China is there. They have some energy agreements where Russia would supply them with energy, which China is going to need. They've also struck a deal with Iran, a $420 billion deal over the course of 20 years or so. So there are some nefarious people, nefarious nations striking some deals to kind of get around this, and cryptocurrencies, digital currency, will play a big role in it. What is happening in the darknet, a gathering for criminals and terrorist activities. This becomes all the more complicated with far-reaching consequences due to the ability to spread fake news, conspiracy theories. What we are seeing on conventional networks is child's play compared to the darknet, with these criminals, psychopaths, terrorists, and spies sitting on the network. And then the breakdown and collapse of international orders and systems. An illustration of this can be seen in Vienna, the Iranian agreements, or the JCPA. I don't know if I got the acronym right, but you know what I'm talking about. The nuclear agreements with Iran that's happening over in Vienna, and just how crazy that is. So these are the concerns that he pointed out, and he goes into a lot more detail. I showed it to you. If you're following me on video, you can see all that information, and I'm sure you can find that on the net if you wanted to read more. But I do find it interesting because he's citing something that the world is observing. And ultimately, these are some of the signs, I would say, that is eventually will lead to the return of Jesus. Let's see. Very quickly, I want to go to Babylon. I know it's just like, Babylon, what are you talking about here? I presented this about 18, 19 months ago to a Bible study I work with here, easy for me to say. Babylon is being built up again. And the reason I wanted to talk about this very quickly is it's the second most mentioned city in Scripture. It is mentioned 287 times in 253 verses. You can first see it in Genesis 10, then in Revelation 21. Jeremiah 50:51 mentions it 37 times. It has so much to do with the end times. It becomes a hub and a capital for the Antichrist during the 7 years of tribulation. And, it started, you can go back to the Tower of Babel. It's in Babylon, is in modern day Iraq. Then you had King Hussein in the 90s and early 2000s, felt like he was going to be the successor or reincarnation of Nebuchadnezzar. He wanted to build up ancient Babylon to what it once was, going back to the Babylonian Empire. And people look at that and go, well, look at Babylon today. It's a mess. It's crushed. But let me just let me cite some things here that I find interesting. Dr. Henry Morris did an observation of this about Babylon. He said it is indeed a prime prospect for rebuilding, entirely apart from any prophetic intimation. Its location is the most ideal in the world for any kind of international center. Not only is it the most beautiful and fertile, not is it only, I'm sorry, the beautiful and fertile Tigris-Euphrates plain, but it is near some of the world's largest oil reserves. Babylon is very near the geographical center of the Earth's land masses. It's within navigable distances of the Persian Gulf and the crossroads of three great continents, Africa, Asia, and Europe. So he views this as the perfect location. And I wanted to kind of cite something else that I found interesting in the Iraqi war by the Americans. They built an enormous complex in Baghdad, like almost the size of Vatican City. It's got its own government for the most part, water systems and several, I forget what it is. 104 acres, 27 buildings, the length of 80 football fields, and it's the size of Vatican City with its own self-defense force. Why? And this is only about 50, 60 miles from Babylon. So, my antenna goes up and was, well, what do they know that we don't know? So just, an interesting point there, and I show you for an overhead view of what that looked like. I don't know what the status of it is now, but I do know that we're still there. So my point here is skeptics can abound, but yet the United Nations and other agencies in Iraq are building this up. You have trade, you have tourism is now, being built up, and there's a real desire by the government to build this up. The problem has been the medical situation with the last couple of years, that we dealt with, and how that hindered, all different parts of different economies and whatnot. But also the oil reserves. It hammered the oil reserves. It has the 5th largest oil reserve. So I say there's a change in the wind that's happening now, because you have so many people, millions and millions of dollars going into this, if not close to $1 billion. And now with what's happening on the energy markets, Iraq's oil reserves become a huge play and what could be coming down the road. So that could help facilitate what eventually will be built up in Babylon. And then I just show you on video some artist renditions of what they are envisioning, what they're seeing. And, this could be. I know a lot of people would say that when it comes to Babylon and Revelation in the Bible, and they say it's a spiritual element, they're citing Revelation 17, I understand that. But it's a real city. And if you look at what eventually will come, it even says that Babylon will fall in a day. And I believe the Lord when he says, that the city of Babylon is the city of Babylon. A lot of people have tried to say it could be New York City because of the relationship to the markets and the water. And I think some others have said maybe Abu Dhabi. I personally believe that Babylon is Babylon, and it's no mistake. I think that's what we will see as time goes by. But, that's just, as I say, my opinion. I wanted to also point out some interesting developments that I think, if you look at the development of nations, now, the nations will be broken up into 4 different categories: East, West, North, and South, and it all has to do with the relationship with Israel. They're kind of lining up exactly as the Bible laid it out. So you have what's the European Union, which will probably be, the United States will probably be in that 4th and final union, which will have house the Antichrist. Then you have the Northern Federation of the Russia and its allies. A lot of that has to do with Ezekiel 38 and 39. The kings of the East, that would be predominantly China. They're mentioned that they have to travel over the Euphrates, that the Euphrates will be supernaturally dried up with an army, according to John in Revelation, of 200 million. Only China can deliver 200 million man army. They've been able to do so since the mid-60s. And then you have the kings of the South, which you have this North African allegiance, and that's starting to take shape with Libya and Algeria and Sudan. Even though Sudan has a good relationship now with Israel, I think things will probably go sour. But all of this is kind of taking shape and lining up exactly how the Bible laid out. So this Federation of Nations, kind of look at that and see what's happening around the world. It's shaping up exactly as what the Lord had prophesied. And it may happen that what we see in Europe, in Western Europe, how they're forming together now, and they're having this alliance in support of the Ukraine, this may help foster their developments towards what will eventually be that what I would call Roman Empire 2.0. I do say there's a fly in the ointment. And the fly in the ointment is Turkey. Turkey is kind of 1 foot in, 1 foot out. And they're in NATO, so how they can become part of that allegiance or alliance with Russia and Iran and others that will be involved, they will. They will, they will eventually fall that way or lead that way. But that's not the case now. So that's an interesting development. That's something to keep your eye on. What happens to Turkey? What happens to their relationships? Erdogan has been pretty vocal about his desire to help lead the Ottoman Empire again, much like Russia. I mean, Putin would like to build up Mother Russia. I think Erdogan has aspirations of building up the old Ottoman Empire and its strength and the leader in the Muslim world. And you have some power players that are happening in the Muslim world because Saudi Arabia, obviously with Mecca, then you have the Shia Muslims with Iran, and that's why they're battling them, and the Houthis, and all of that's why they're going after Bahrain, the UAE, Saudi Arabia, because of their alliances with Israel. So they want to be the power player in it, and it's all of them want the control of the Temple Mount. They all want to get back to what's happening on the Temple Mount because it always points to all of prophecy will always point to Israel, the relationship with Israel. What is the center of Israel? Jerusalem. They want to get to Jerusalem. It's all about Jerusalem. But what do they really want? The center of the center is the Temple Mount. And that's ultimately what the end game is, and that's kind of where they're going. So those are some interesting developments and things to look at. Let's go to the Canadian crackdowns. I mean, we saw what happened there. No surprise. Everybody knows about that. But what's shocking, and, sitting here in America, seeing our neighbors to the north and just wonderful people, and, what happened there where the Trudeau cracked down on them to the point where, taking over bank accounts, taking the truckers' livelihoods. If you supplied, if you gave a donation, there was one story of a woman gave, I think, a $50 donation. They froze her bank account. And this was even before the actions taken by Trudeau, and there was some law where he has the right to do this based, I think it had to do with 9/11 and terrorism. It's just out of control. So you have an authoritarian type government coming down against the people there. Now, this isn't a republic the way we know it. I know America tends to look at Canada and go, oh, it's frightening because it's, again, about freedom. But I would say their rule of government is more closer to the British. But nonetheless, what happened there is absolutely astounding. And the crackdown of these people, putting so many in jail and taking their bank accounts. So, I mean, that's something to look at. So, you do have the government there has come against churches over the last year or two. So what happens if they freeze bank accounts for companies, for churches? They want you to line up exactly as the way they're dictating it, putting it that way. And that was kind of a real shock. Then you have the medical pandemic, which is in the third stage, and what I would say, hopefully the final for now anyway. We've had the Alpha, the Delta, and now Omicron. Now these three variants, they called for the lockdowns and the mandates. Now we're at the tail end of it. But even, that was the heart of what was about in Canada. So you have to wonder, is this an authoritarian spirit? And that may sound a little spooky or a little out there for some people, but ultimately that is what you're going to be dealing with when you're talking about the tribulation. So it is now clear that the default position of the left is bigger government, more coercion, and greater control. I want to point to an interesting poll that was taken in February. And here's what it said, and this was in America. 59% of Democratic voters would favor a government policy requiring citizens remain confined to their homes in all times except for emergency if they refuse to comply with the medical mandates. Nearly half of Democratic voters would think federal and state governments should be able to fine or imprison individuals who publicly question the efficacy of the existing vaccines on social media, television, radio, or online. 45% favor governments requiring citizens to temporarily live in designated facilities or locations if they refuse, and 29% support temporarily removing parents' custody of their children if they refuse. That's a pretty telling indictment of how divided this country is. And, you know, when I was growing up, liberals were liberals, and been saying for 20 years, that's gone, because they would fight against things like this, but now they're supporting it. So the times, they are a-changing. Let me switch gears to something else now. John Durham, who was the assigned, I think his lead title for this would be prosecutor, but at any rate, he had to look into the actions that were taken during this whole bizarre Russiagate thing that we saw in the 45th administration. We now know was a big fallacy and lie. And I would say anybody with 2 ounces of common sense would know that this was a lie to begin with. But they made this big charade, and so at any rate, he has gone on and indicted several different people, lawyers that are directly affiliated with Hillary, her campaign, and saying that he has evidence of bringing them, that they not only helped finance the information that came against the 45th president, but hacked into servers, spied on the servers as a candidate and as a president in the White House. And what happened? Spying on servers, infiltrating servers in our White House. That's the accusation. And I will say, innocent until proven guilty, but that's the accusation that's been brought about by our members of our Justice Department. And so Watergate is nothing. It's a drop in the bucket compared to what's being played out here. What happened? You would think that would be all over the airwaves and being reported. Nothing. It was like, don't look here, nah, which just goes to show you the propaganda and the control of information that's happening in this country. It's absolutely, it's a crime, but this is the real world of what we're living in today. So my other point is this exact same cast of characters that dragged this country through the mud for 2.5, 3 years with this whole nonsense and impeachment and the charade and the parade that they made, the mockery. They were an absolute intellectual embarrassment. These are the same people that are trying to drum up insurrection from January 6th. That was the new word of the day for 5 or 10 days. That's all you ever heard, the parrots in the media. Insurrection. And then, of course, the yahoos and social media would, this is insurrection. They didn't even know the word a couple of weeks beforehand. So those exact same people that knowingly, intentionally drag this country down. And if you look at what happened in Ukraine right now, these are the same people that took or attempted to take down Ukraine, say that they were you had these phone calls and agreements with Zelensky and 45, and they built up this whole charade and this whole bit of carnival nonsense, and that took Ukraine down pegs and said, well, they're corrupt, so they can't get in. We can't help them, and that's why they can't get into NATO. But then we find out that 46 is directly tied into them, and we knew that from his videos and things that were released. So when you hear these Democrats now want to get on board and support Ukraine, but yet 2 years ago, a year and a half ago, they were doing everything they can to Ukraine. So I'm just pointing out the absurdity of the nonsense. But last, I'll just say, what we have to realize is the dark money. There are hundreds of billions of dollars that are attempting to control this country, that have infiltrated our government on all different levels, state government, county governments, and unfortunately the federal government. I'm not making any specific accusations. I'm just saying that we can't believe necessarily everything that's coming out of there. We have to realize, in order to move towards a global government, you have to take down the United States pegs. You have to bring them down and make that clear playing field. So, I just think it's obviously bizarre. Food shortages, we're going to, with everything that's going on, we talked about Ukraine, we talked about the production of wheat will go down and corn and whatnot, how that will drive up inflation. That's up over 7.5%, 7.5%. It's going to go even higher because of what's happening in Ukraine and Russia and the gas and food shortages. Then you had what I call the woke censor police, what happens with Joe Rogan. Most people are familiar with that, how they tried to shut him down. And I would say, and it looks like they're trying to shut down a lot of podcasters. People who, I think a lot of the woke police are concerned about having individual thought process, rational delivery of information, and breaking it down. So, that's something else to look at. Last, I just wanted to point out to the Beijing Olympics. It's almost like, ooh, what happened? There was Olympics, wasn't there? And, the world said no. The world looked at the genocide and the absurdity. The companies that got involved in that and the sponsorships, the corporations, they basically chose money over human rights, and they took a bath. The broadcast rights for NBC, they got hammered. I think they made a commitment to 2032 of $7.75 billion. That's just for the rights. Never mind all the money they have to put out for their own production and cameras and crews and marketing and development. And it's an incredible amount of money, but there was practically no interest for this at all, which hammered the Chinese aspirations, and they wanted to roll out their digital currencies and utilize that. So I just kind of wanted to point out that it was interesting to me to see the world come together and work together, much like what we're seeing, where the world appears to be unified in their opposition to Russia. What's happening there, you're at, like I said, day 6. The odds, most people thought that would have been down in 2 or 3 days. So God bless the Ukrainian people and what they're trying to do. And again, I'm just going to say one more time, please continue to pray for these people. Continue to pray for the churches, the ministries there. And I would say that the world would be smart to take a look at the importance of working together, standing up for what's right, for moral principles, for freedom, for love for one another, for working together and for the right causes, because the wrong causes are trying to come your way. And the bottom line is, no matter what happens, Jesus is Lord. Jesus has everything under control. And for those of you who do not believe, I strongly encourage you to look at all of the information that's in the Bible, and that there's no way you can say that Jesus is not Lord, because it is overwhelming evidence of the proof when we talk about prophecy, things that have come to pass that defy human odds. And again, we're maybe looking at the precursor to Ezekiel 38. Think about that, a 2,500-year-old prophecy. All the nations are starting to line up exactly as the prophet said. So take that for what it's worth. I just want to say thank you for your time. As always, I've lost my slide again. I'm getting better at this, though. My name is Mark Russak. You've been watching and listening to the Russak Outlook. So thank you so much. I appreciate you. God bless you. Questions, comments, email Mark Russ or email russackoutlook@gmail.com. And I'll be happy to take and answer any of your questions or comments. Do so on social media. Share the information. I just want to thank you again for your time. My name is Mark Russak. And remember, as always, just my opinion.